Hey, this is Tyler, and today I am talking to you about being a guest on podcasts. Now, in yesterday's episode, I talked about why being a guest on a podcast can be such a great strategy for getting the word out and attracting some potential students for your online course. And I talked about some ways that you can search for podcasts that you potentially want to get interviewed on. So I left you with that task of putting together a list of a bunch of podcasts that you think are a good fit. Now, the next step before you actually reach out to a podcast host and ask for an interview is to just quickly do a bit of research on that show ahead of time, just to make sure that it is a good fit. So one of the ways that you can research a podcast is directly on iTunes. Every podcast has a description and a listing of all those recent episodes that they've published. It's also a good idea to visit their website, have a look around, read some of the articles on their blog, look at some of the guests that have appeared on the show, check them out on social media. Those are pretty much the three main places that you want to spend your time, just getting a little bit familiar with the show. And of course, if you listen to a few of their episodes, if you listen to some of the interviews that have been published on that show, that'll give you a really good idea of the host style, what kind of topics have been discussed, and just what kind of format they have for their episodes. As you're doing this research, there are three questions that you want to answer. Now, the first question is this podcast relevant to my topic? And another way of framing that is, do they serve your target audience? So maybe the podcast isn't directly about your topic or whatever it is that you teach in your course, but that doesn't mean that their target audience wouldn't be interested in your course. So you just want to make sure that it is relevant, it's not a stretch, it's not a long shot that their listeners would be interested in your subject. For example, if you find a podcast about graphic design and you've got a course on Photoshop, a lot of those listeners who are graphic designers are probably interested in learning how to use Photoshop. There isn't a disconnect there. There's definitely a good fit there. So you want to make sure it's relevant. That's the first question. Second question is the podcast still active? So if you reach out to a podcast host that's no longer active, it just makes you look really bad because it only takes a second to figure this out. On iTunes, you're going to see all the recent episodes and just take a look at the date that it was published. So if they haven't published something for a few weeks or even a few months, and especially a year or two, then there's a really good chance the podcast is no longer active. So there's really no point sending them the whole pitch or that whole email asking to be a guest. You maybe just want to check with the host on social media and say, hey, I just came across your podcast, noticed you haven't published anything in a while. Is it still active? Are you looking for guests? The third question you want to answer is, do they do interviews? Not all podcasts are interview-based. So a really easy way to check that out is, again, look on iTunes or look on their website, look for the names of guests. If you don't see any names of guests on any of the episodes, it's probably not an interview-based podcast. So reaching out to them and asking for an interview is going to be a bit of a long shot. Those are the three questions that you want to be able to answer. If you answer yes to all three of those questions, then the next step is to go ahead and contact the podcast host. Now, after speaking with several podcast hosts and asking them how they like to be contacted, I basically narrowed it down to three methods. The first is email, the second is social media, and the third is the contact form on their website. Now, most podcast hosts end up booking their interviews and coordinating those interviews in email anyways. So even if you start the conversation on social media or if you fill out a contact form on their website, those conversations get moved to email anyway, so where you make your pitch is probably going to be in an email. Now, if you reach out to a podcast host on social media, your goal should just be to ask permission. Ask permission to pitch them. Ask them if they're looking for guests, let them know you think you'd be a good fit and you'd like to send them some more information, and then ask for their email address so that you can do so. Same thing in their contact form, let them know you're interested in being a guest on their show. Once you get a response through email, then you can keep the conversation going there. And some podcast hosts will even have an application form on their website for interviews, and they'll ask you for some details up front, like your bio and what you'd want to discuss. And so they're actually going to check you out before they respond to you. But regardless of how you first get in touch with the podcast host, once you get that response, once you get that email, you basically have to pitch them. And there are a few things you want to include in a pitch. But the number one rule is when you reach out to a podcast host is it has to be a customized email. Don't put together a template that you send to 10 podcast hosts. And if you hire somebody like a PR firm, for example, to reach out to podcast hosts on your behalf, make sure that they're not sending templated emails as well. It's really easy for a podcast host to spot an email template. They know if it's been sent to a lot of people, they might not even respond to you. And if they do, it's probably going to be no thank you. So make sure you're sending a custom email to every single host that you reach out to. Let them know how you found their show. Let them know you listened to a few episodes. Tell them which episode you really liked or why you like their show. Then tell them why you think you'd be a good fit for your show. So obviously you want to introduce yourself, give them your name, the link to your website, your company or the company you work for, some links to some of your work, just so that they can check those things out, and you're showing that credibility, that proof that you have expertise on whatever it is that you want to discuss with them. Then you want to give them some ideas of what you actually want to talk about. Give them maybe a small bullet list of talking points or subjects that you're most prepared to discuss on your podcast. And if you notice that one of those things has been discussed before, maybe just tell them how you're going to come at it from a different angle, or you're going to share a more recent example or a recent story, or something that still adds value to their audience, even though it's already been touched on in a previous episode. So the key word here is value. So talk to the podcast host in terms of the value that you can provide to their audience. Now, another thing you want to include in your pitch is some social proof. So if you've been on any podcast before, maybe include a link or two to some of those interviews so they can quickly go and see or even listen to an interview that you've done before. If you have any connections in common, don't be afraid to drop that name of that person you have in common. That's a great way to break the ice and just validate the fact that you would be worth having as a guest on the show. And I would also recommend offering to hop on a quick call with them. Not every podcast host will be comfortable committing to interviewing you based just on the information that you send them in an email. And they probably are going to go scope you out online. They're going to check out your social media. They're going to check out your website. If you're willing to have a quick call with them just to figure out what you want to focus on during the interview, or what you guys want to discuss, or just help make sure that you have a rapport there, be willing to do that. So that's what you want to include in your actual pitch. Most podcast hosts will get back to you pretty soon, but even if they don't, even if you don't hear from them for a week or two, don't be afraid to send a quick email just to check in and see if they received your request to be interviewed. And maybe it's just the wrong time for them, so you can always ask permission to reconnect in a couple of months. Maybe they're already fully booked for the next few weeks or the next few months. So that's how you pitch a podcast host and what to include in your email to the podcast. So make sure you join me on Thursday's episode, where I'm going to talk to you about how you can prepare for your interview and how you can give a great interview that podcast host and their listeners are going to love. So thanks so much, and I will see you on the next episode.